Hey everyone, Baylor here. I got the idea to try and highlight some important people for Black History Month, but to do so in a way that highlighted who they were and what they accomplished in an objective fashion. When trying to decide who to spotlight, it occurred to me that the best thing that I could do would be to speak about people in fields that overlap with my own knowledge and experience. But even after narrowing it down to just people in my fields of expertise, and then just people in music, and then just guitarists, once I sat down to compile a list, that list went well over 28 names pretty much immediately. One note when you're watching these videos, please keep in mind that I use TikTok for the easy creation tools, but it does mean that the video quality, the sound quality, and of course the screen orientation were all limited by what TikTok offers. Anyway, here are 56 guitarists, each one important to me.
When you talk to me, watch the tone of your voice.
Samuel Lightnin Hopkins recorded a bunch of sides from 1946 to 1954, which are definitely acoustic country blues, but by the mid-60s, he was recording exclusively with the band, and he had moved entirely to an electric guitar. Once he had made the switch to electric, his aggressive tone and comping style, his talking blues style, and his willingness to stretch a solo out for multiple choruses, it all laid the groundwork for what was to become Texas blues. You can definitely hear a heavy Lightnin Hopkins influence in the music of ZZ Top. In fact, there's an independent record label called Arhoolie Records that was founded when Chris Strachwitz moved from Texas to 1960 specifically to record Lightnin Hopkins, after he'd heard Lightnin Hopkins' 1960 album Mojo Hand. Arhoolie became the record label for everyone from Clifton Chenier to Robin Ford. And right at that time, right about 1960, is when Lightnin Hopkins was hitting his stride. That fall, he played Carnegie Hall with Joan Baez and Pete Seeger. By the end of the 60s, he had teamed up with the 13th Floor Elevators to record Free-Form Patterns. And it's just as far out as you think it is. All through the 60s and 70s, Lightnin Hopkins was releasing music at a steady pace of 1 or 2 albums a year. He toured a ton, played all the festivals, becoming one of the most well-known blues artists of the time. And for you musicians out there wanting to develop your ear, I highly recommend trying to play rhythm guitar to any Lightnin Hopkins recording. I don't think he ever once landed on exactly 12 bars. The one and only way to know when the chord was about to change was to listen. Aside from Mojo Hand, check out Guitar Lightnin from Lightnin Strikes and the utterly baffling Fox Chase from Free-Form Patterns. Lightnin Hopkins. Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. If you get why I said that, then you already know that we're talking about Hound Dog Taylor. For those of you that don't get the reference, in the movie The Princess Bride, Inigo Montoya was after a 6-fingered man. And Theodore Roosevelt, Hound Dog Taylor, had 6 fingers on his left hand. He was actually born with 6 fingers on both hands, but one day he got drunk and, well, let's say he woke up the next morning with only 5 on his right hand. Hound Dog Taylor was born in Natchez, Mississippi, but moved to Chicago in his 20s, and even though he'd been playing music in some fashion for all of his life, he didn't become a full-time musician until 1957, at the age of 42. And even then, he was little known outside of the Chicago blues scene until the late 60s, when he began touring with Little Walter and Coco Taylor. And it was then that a shipping clerk for Delmark Records, Bruce Iglauer, tried to convince his bosses to sign Hound Dog Taylor. And when they refused, he founded his own label, the now legendary Alligator Records. Their first release, Hound Dog Taylor and the House Rockers, includes Taylor's best-known song, Give Me Back My Wig. You can describe Hound Dog Taylor's music as boogie plus slide, all turned up to 11. And I do have to say something about the sound of his guitar. He played a Teisco SD40. It's an inexpensive Japanese 4-pickup monstrosity. And in Hound Dog Taylor's hands, it sounded as if the electronics inside were actively in the process of melting. During his life, Hound Dog Taylor was able to release only 3 recordings for Alligator, but they've since released another 3 posthumously. Aside from Give Me Back My Wig, listen to Let's Get Funky from Beware of the Dog, and Take 5 from Natural Boogie. Hound Dog Taylor. McKinley Morganfield was a force of nature. Born in Mississippi on Stovall Plantation near Clarksdale, and like so many other musicians of his time, he recorded some early sides in Mississippi, but eventually he moved north to Chicago. By the way, would it surprise you to learn that if you caught a northbound train in the Mississippi Delta, the big cities you hit as you head north are Memphis, St. Louis, and Chicago? That line's called the Illinois Central. Oh, and there's another train line that goes from Dallas to Kansas City. That's called the KT, as in she caught the Katy. Okay, getting back to Muddy Waters. His records from the early 40s on chess were the templates for Chicago blues. And you'd be hard-pressed to find another blues musician who had a greater impact on popular culture than Muddy Waters. Just look at his catalog. I'm ready. I got my mojo working. Hoochie Coochie Man, Trouble No More, Can't Lose What You Never Had. I Just Want to Make Love to You, Mannish Boy. Even folks who have never once spun a blues album know these songs. I'm not sure what else I can tell you. Muddy Waters was the man. I suppose I could tell you a little bit of the story about the time that Dickie Betts sat in with Muddy Waters and his band in the early 70s. And once Dickie started playing a little bit more, well, let's just say grandiose, Luther Johnson accidentally hit Dickie with the neck of his guitar. And let's talk about Muddy's slide playing for just a minute. The cutting, responsive, dynamic, round sound he got from the neck pickup of that Telecaster. That was the slide sound for decades. As for what to listen to, it doesn't matter. Pick any of them. They're all great. But if you want something you might not have heard before, listen to the title track from his 1974 album, Unk in Funk. If that don't make you smile, I don't know what will. Muddy Waters. It's time to boogie chillin'. I can't think of any other guitarist that can do more with a single chord than John Lee Hooker. The rumbling, churning, propelling grooves he was able to get just by sitting on an E chord and stomping his foot. If you play guitar, try it. Get yourself a metal folding chair, sit down in the kitchen, and just try and get a groove going that swings as hard as Boogie Chillin'. It's not easy. John Lee Hooker's migration north from Mississippi took him to Detroit, where he ended up working factory jobs during World War II while playing in the clubs at night. He was working in a steel mill in 1948 when his demo of Boogie Chillin' was released. And by the end of 1949, it had become the best-selling race record of the year. One thing I love about his early sides is he tried to skirt around the restrictions of his record contracts by constantly recording under different names. All through the 50s, he would sign up with a company using some made-up name, release an album, then sign up with another company. So if you hear anything from John Lee Booker, Delta John, Texas Slim, Birmingham Sam and his magic guitar, the Boogeyman, it's all John Lee Hooker. By the 1960s, though, his albums were becoming much more mainstream and his concerts better attended, and by mixed audiences. By the end of the 60s, he'd done the Lightnin Hopkins thing and hooked up with a group of kids to record an album, but this time it was Canned Heat. Plus, he recorded Roadhouse Blues with the Doors in 1969. And although by today's standards it kind of sounds overproduced, there was a revival period in the late 80s and early 90s that had some cool stuff to it. With that 1989 album, The Healer, he played with Santana, with Bonnie Raitt, with Los Lobos, and with Canned Heat again. Aside from Boogie Chillin', you know the good ones already. Boom Boom, One Bourbon, One Scotch, One Beer, Dimples, John Lee Hooker. I mean, if you thought Hound Dog Taylor's guitar was a mutant, you should have seen what Elmore James played. He had a K Dreadnought-style acoustic guitar, 1956 K6000, onto which he had mounted two D'Armond pickups and then wired himself a preamp, skills that he learned during World War II during his service in the Navy. The result was a screaming unholy terror. Legend says that on quiet nights you can still hear it feeding back. But he sure could play it. Elmore James was absolutely deserving of the title King of Slide Guitar. His technique allowed him to blend open chords with single-note filths with heavy use of arpeggios, a style that's still copied to this day. Stylistically, Elmore James used elements of Chicago blues and R&B, often employing a horn section. His tunes could be raucous, they could be soulful, they could be sophisticated. He played around a lot with form and with straight time. His work in the early 50s definitely predicts the advent of rock and roll by the end of the decade. The Sky is Crying, covered by everyone from Albert King to Stevie Ray Vaughan.
That's his. And of course, in the Beatles' tune For You Blue from Let It Be, you can hear George say, Elmore James got nothing on this, baby, when John takes a solo on a lap steel. But if there's one thing that Elmore James will forever be known for, it's this. Groundbreaking. Absolutely as iconic to blues as the intro to Johnny B. Good is to rock. Aside from The Sky is Crying, check out Shake Your Moneymaker and his recording of Willie Dixon's Can't Hold Out. Elmore James. A welter of metal stress harmonic transients and a singular tonal plasticity. That's what New York Times music critic Robert Palmer had to say about the sound of CeDell Davis's guitar playing. Don't climb into CeDell Davis's catalog looking for normal. That's not what he does. Well, for starters, he's from Arkansas, so there's that. As a kid, CeDell Davis used to play guitar with his friends, but he got polio pretty bad, which severely reduced his mobility in both of his hands. So he taught himself to play slide using a knife over the back of the neck. And once he got that down, he started traveling throughout the Mississippi Delta area, playing with Robert Nighthawk primarily. Then one night during a police raid, he got trampled by the crowd trying to flee the nightclub, resulting in both legs being broken and him being confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. There's several videos out there of CeDell Davis playing solo, and when I watch it, it's kind of hard for me to match the sound with the motion. I almost get the feeling like I'm watching a dubbed foreign movie. The fact that I even know CeDell Davis, and a lot of what I learned about him, it all comes directly from musicians that I know that's worked with him. Eric Sanders, Derek Trucks, Oteil Burbridge, and Colonel Bruce Hampton. He's just one of those guys that attracted talent. Peter Buck and Scott McCaughey from REM, Barrett Martin from Screaming Trees, Alex Valey, who played with everyone from Reggie Watts to Dave Matthews. They've all recorded with CeDell Davis. I recommend starting with his album Feel Like Doing Something Wrong, since it's mostly solo, and then once you're ready, spin the best of CeDell Davis. CeDell Davis. So who's that smiling man with the polka dot guitar that just ripped your head off? That's Buddy Guy. Born in Louisiana, Buddy Guy began his career by moving to Chicago and teaming up with Ike Turner, making a name for himself as a session guitarist. As a session guitarist working for Chess Records, through the 60s he worked with many of the heavy hitters in Chicago blues, Muddy Waters, Sonny Boy Williamson, Howlin' Wolf, just to name a few. In fact, Buddy Guy's playing acoustic guitar on Howlin' Wolf's original recording of Killin' Floor. And he only recorded one album under his own name during his Chess years, and that's called Left My Blues in San Francisco. But if you haven't heard it, do yourself a favor. Oh, and check this out. While he was signed to Chess, Buddy Guy would occasionally do session work for other labels, but he would use the name Friendly Chap. But despite working non-stop all through the 70s and 80s, he only came to the wider public attention in 1991 with his release of Damn Right I Got the Blues, which came out shortly after he was asked to play Royal Albert Hall as part of Clapton's big 24-night blues guitar shindig thing. So for the first 30 years of his career, Buddy Guy was the secret sauce in a lot of classic Chicago blues recordings. And for the second 30 years of his career, he's widely known as one of the best guitarist to ever pick up Stratocaster. But even now at age 85, he's still working pretty much non-stop. Before the pandemic, he was doing like 130 shows a year. Aside from his first album, Left My Blues in San Francisco, I say check out his most recent album actually, The Blues Is Alive and Well. And the one that I find the most fun is his 1972 album, Hold That Plane. It's got a cover of Watermelon Man by Herbie Hancock. Buddy Guy. In the 1980s, while most music had taken a more decidedly futuristic turn, suddenly there was a guy with a super clean Stratocaster strung with piano wires, plus he had a soulful voice, and just like that, blues was back on the radio. You'd be forgiven if you thought I was talking about Stevie Ray Vaughan, but the truth is, Robert Cray released his first album 3 years before SRV. Robert Cray was the first of a new generation of blues musicians that came up inspired by the greats that had emigrated out of the South during the 1930s and 40s. Cray's generation was free from the regional musical restrictions and was able to synthesize the best of everything that came before. Because although Cray was born in Georgia, he was raised in Tacoma, Washington.
pretty damn far from the Illinois Central. Inspired by seeing Albert Collins and Freddie King live, at the age of 20 he got his own band together, the Cray. Based out of Eugene, Oregon, they toured all over the West Coast. And that, by the way, is how he ended up with a bit part in Animal House. He was the bass player for Otis Day and the Knights. Remember Shout? You know, in 1986, when he started getting a lot of attention because of Smoking Gun from the album Strong Persuader, he started working with a ton of folks. John Lee Hooker, Chuck Berry, Keith Richards, Tina Turner. Plus, he participated in a ton of the guitar summits that were happening at the time, hosted by Eric Clapton. He's working with Buddy Guy and Stevie Ray Vaughan and Jimmy Vaughan. And he's still going strong. If you haven't checked out Robert Cray's albums recently, I encourage you to do so. His most recent album, That's What I Heard, it's solid. And if you haven't heard it yet, the 2014 release, In My Soul, that's a killer. Aside from In My Soul and Strong Persuader, I say check out another one of his early albums on Mercury, False Accusations. Robert Cray.
We come at last to the beginning of the Three Kings. Born Albert Nelson in Indianola, Mississippi, which is a town I'm sure we'll talk about again, Albert King looms large in blues history. And not just because he was 6'7", 250 pounds. That's just over 2 meters, just over 110 kilograms for our non-imperial friends. But also because he made one of the most important albums in the history of the blues. Believe it or not, when he first started performing in Mississippi, he took the name Albert King and he named his guitar Lucy in order to try and associate himself with the widely popular B.B. King. But in 1953, after not getting much traction in Mississippi, he moved north, landing in, of all places, Gary, Indiana. And there he actually ended up in Jimmy Reed's band as his drummer. But when Gary wasn't getting much action for him either, he ended up moving to Brooklyn, Illinois. It's a little town just on the other side of the river from St. Louis. And there he actually started doing club work with people like Chuck Berry and Ike Turner. But club success wasn't enough for him, so he moved again, this time to Memphis. And there he started working with Booker T and the MGs, recording sides for Stax Records. Good gig. And in 1967, Stax collected 11 of those singles, released it as an album called Born Under a Bad Sign. And if that was the only thing Albert King ever did in his career, that would be enough to have him in the list of the most important guitarists in my life. Because what you finally hear on Born Under a Bad Sign is what Albert King could do on a guitar. With that upside down flying V, he was able to display one of the true masterpieces of quiet intensity. The confidence with which he plays on that album is breathtaking. Aside from Born Under a Bad Sign, which you definitely should have heard by now, listen to 1973's I Want to Get Funky. That one's a lot of fun. And I'm in a Phone Booth Baby from 1984. Albert King. See if any of this sounds familiar. Otis Rush was born in the 1930s in Mississippi, moved to Chicago in the late 40s. And if you've ever wondered how it was that all the rock guitar gods from the 60s ended up with the same kind of sounding phrasing and dynamics, no further than Otis Rush. As a teenager, when I learned that a good portion of Led Zeppelin's songs were not, in fact, Led Zeppelin songs, I went on a quest to find out where they came from. And during that time, I think the biggest eureka moment I had was when I found Otis Rush's original recording of I Can't Quit You. Hearing him play, it just reminded me so much of everything I'd heard from Clapton, from Page, from Michael Bloomfield, from Peter Green. This was the source for a lot of the way that British guitar playing sounded. During the late 50s and early 60s, Otis Rush released singles for a dozen or so labels, including some for Chess, but it was Cotillion Records that signed him and allowed him to finally get into the studio to record a full album. That studio was Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, and his backing band was the legendary Fame Swampers, which at that point included Duane Allman. And the album was Morning in the Morning. The sound of the album was equal parts blues and soul, and it kills. Produced by Michael Bloomfield even. And through the 70s, Otis Rush toured some more, released some more albums, but by the end of the decade, he had pretty much retired. With the exception of a live album in 1985, retired is largely where he stayed until the mid-90s when he released his first studio album in more than 15 years. Ain't Enough Coming In. After that, he stayed touring and recording for the rest of his life. Aside from I Can't Quit You and Morning in the Morning, Do Spin Ain't Enough Coming In. It's definitely worth it. Otis Rush. Are there artists in your life that seem to be connected or give off similar energy even though they're from different genres or even from different media? There are a few like that for me. For example, the novels of Ray Bradbury and the compositions of Dave Brubeck seem very similar to me. Another one for me, though, is the jazz of Freddie Hubbard and the blues of Freddie King. Not because they're both named Freddie, not even because they look a little bit alike, but because their approach to their instruments. They both have a lot of intensity and a lot of virtuosity in their music. They also demanded a lot from their bands, and both can knock you clean off your feet. Originally from Texas, Freddie King is another one that moved to Chicago young to get a start in blues. He was another one that was sneaking into the clubs in Chicago's South Side to see Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and the rest of the heavies at the time. He started his own band and started recording in the early 1950s, working with a lot of the prominent sidemen at the time, including Robert Lockwood Jr., Jimmy Rogers. Freddie King's path to national notoriety started in 1960 when he recorded the single Have You Ever Loved a Woman, and during the same recording session recorded the instrumental Hideaway, which was a crossover hit, charting in the R&B charts. And Hideaway brought Freddie King to the attention of another king, King Curtis, who not only covered the tune, but also got Freddie King signed to Atlantic Records in 1968. And once that connection was made to Atlantic Records and that crowd, Freddie King started working with some truly heavy hitters, not just in the blues scene, but nationally. In the late 60s and early 70s, he was signed to Leon Russell's label after his contract with Atlantic expired. He performed with Eric Clapton. He was mentioned by Grand Funk Railroad in their song We're an American Band. And he was engineered by Tom Dowd. You have to wonder what the 80s blues scene might have been like if Freddie King hadn't worked himself so hard. Aside from Have You Ever Loved a Woman and Hideaway, listen to Going Down, that's a classic, and plus the 1974 album Burglar. Freddie King. There have been a few musicians out there that have been more popular among fellow musicians than among general music fans. Roy Buchanan, for example, made a career for himself as being the world's best unknown guitarist. But if you were to ask the blues greats from the 1950s and 60s who their favorite guitarist was, one name will show up on pretty much every list. Earl Hooker. And again, I have to go back to Led Zeppelin for how I first heard of Earl Hooker. The song You Shook Me from the first Led Zeppelin album. That one has a complicated provenance because even though the song was credited to Willie Dixon and J.B. Lenoir, the version that Led Zeppelin covered was originally recorded by Muddy Waters. But even the Muddy Waters version was originally a song called Blue Guitar, onto which Muddy added vocals, and Blue Guitar was recorded by Earl Hooker. Earl Zebedee Hooker has the standard electric blues origin story. Right? Born in Mississippi, moved to Chicago, hooked up with a local great, this time Bo Diddley, and began his own performing and recording career. But the difference with Earl Hooker is he was completely devoted to mastering guitar. He learned rhythm, lead, slide. He learned blues, country, funk, and jazz. He played lap steel, pedal steel, had a 6 and 12-string double neck. He wasn't afraid to use effects, experimenting with tape delay, wah, and echo. In the studio, he would double-track his own parts and add harmonies to his lead lines. And as a result, he became the favorite of every blues man out there. Even B.B. King said, "To me, he is the best of the modern guitarists." Period. Aside from blue guitar, check out the album Two Bugs and a Roach, and the first album he recorded for Kuka Records, The Genius of Earl Hooker. His stuff from the 70s is a lot of fun too. Earl Hooker. For millions, B.B. King is the blues. Look, if you were to get on a plane and fly to Thimphu, Bhutan, catch a bus into the Bhutanese Himalayas, then get out and hike to the nearest small village and ask the first person you met to name one blues performer, they tell you B.B. King. One sung syllable, one note on a guitar. You know immediately it's B.B. King. I don't think there's any other performer in any other genre that has made their style and their tone so immediately identifiable, all the way down to pickup selection and vibrato technique. Born Riley B. King in Itabena, Mississippi, raised by his grandmother in Indianola, inspired to play guitar by the King Biscuit Radio Hour out of Helena, Arkansas, drove a tractor, played guitar for a local gospel group, moved to Memphis with his cousin Bucka White, met Tbone Walker, who inspired him to get an electric guitar, had his own band by 1949. And by the early 1950s, he was already crossing over to R&B fans. All through the 50s, he was just releasing hit after hit after hit. Every Day I Have the Blues, Woke Up This Morning, Sweet Little Angel, 10 Long Years. By the end of the 1950s, B.B. King was one of the most popular names in blues. Then, in 1964, he recorded the first of 2 live albums that I consider to be among the best live recordings of all time, Live at the Regal. I don't know if there's ever been documented a band more ready to play or a crowd more ready to hear. And by the end of the 1960s, he was opening for the Rolling Stones, winning Grammys, and charting on the pop charts. And in 1970, he recorded his second live masterpiece, Live in Cook County Jail. And this is just touching the surface. There's so many stories I could tell about B.B. King. Met him once, super nice guy. If you haven't heard Live at the Regal or Live in Cook County Jail yet though, stop what you're doing and spin them now. I'm not sure that music gets much better than that. B.B. King.
Closing out 2 weeks of blues performers is an artist that will help ease our way into jazz starting next week, the dynamic Tbone Walker. I think like many of you, I first became aware of Tbone Walker because of covers of Stormy Monday. In my case, it was the Allman Brothers cover from At Fillmore East. But when I started poking around into blues and jazz history, his name kept coming up. Who inspired B.B. King to play electric guitar? Tbone Walker. Who taught Steve Miller to play guitar behind his back? Tbone Walker. Who gave Chuck Berry the idea for his stage persona? Tbone Walker. Where did Jimi Hendrix get the idea to play guitar with his teeth? Yeah. And that's the thing, isn't it? What was revolutionary for rock and roll in the 1960s, Tbone Walker had been doing back in the 40s. Even Stormy Monday dates all the way back to 1947. Because, believe it or not, Aaron Tbone Walker was born in 1910. Blind Lemon Jefferson, blues' first solo success, was a family friend. And while a good portion of Tbone Walker's output feels very Chicago blues inspired, the majority of what he did was high energy, high showmanship jump blues, along the lines of Louis Jordan or Lionel Hampton's big band. But what made Tbone Walker stand out from the other jump blues big band leaders was he was really the only one to feature guitar as the lead instrument. And let's talk about Tbone Walker's guitar style. It was sharp, it was slick, it was clean, the string bends and the chord changes of blues, but the color notes and the partial chords of jazz. He was also unafraid to play low on the neck, which is something I think a lot of guitarists overlook. Aside from Call It Stormy Monday, I say check out T-Bone Shuffle and Two Bones and a Pick. Tbone Walker.